Hello and welcome to Easynomics. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Business Today television. The world's largest election exercise is well and truly underway. Two phases done, and the results of a multi-phase election will be known on the 4th of June. And at that point of time, we will really get to know how India has voted in this round of parliamentary Lok Sabha elections. But the guest on the show today has written a very thought-provoking book, How Does India Vote? And Dr. Surjit Balla, the author, one of India's topmost economists, former executive director for India at the IMF. He served on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, a PhD in economics from Princeton University, and he's done 6 other books. Dr. Balla, welcome to Business Today television. The heat and dust of the Indian election is well and truly underway. And the big question that a lot of people will want to know is, what's your own sense of which way the wind is blowing this time around, sir?
Well, thank you for having me. I've spelled that out in quite a bit of detail in the book, How We Vote, which is with Abhinav Madharam. And the bottom line is that our analysis suggests that the BJP on its own is likely to get somewhere around 330 to 350 votes, and 350 seats, and on its own. And we can go into the details as to how this is not a number picked out of the hat. It is based and discussed in detail in the book. And I'll just tell you for the first number, which is 330, how we get it is that we look at state elections that have taken place and throughout history, but between elections. And the latest state elections between 2019 and 2024, the weighted average gain for the BJP was about 5 percentage points. And if this 5 percentage points were to translate, and obviously it can be a bit more, it can be a bit less, but analysis suggests that it's likely to be close to the state average that we observed. You get something like 330 seats. If there is and that's with a swing, which all of our viewers should be well aware of, that's with a swing of 5%. With a swing of 3%, it's somewhat lower at about 320. And with a swing of 7%, it's somewhere around 350. So that's how we get these numbers. But the book has a lot more than these numbers and goes into great detail as to what is the prime determinant, not the only, but the prime determinant of voting behavior in India, as well as actually it happens to be the prime determinant. I might as well tell you the last line in the book is, it's the economy is stupid. And that said by none other than Bill Clinton in his 1992 election campaign. So what holds true for India, I think holds true for the US, and I think practically every other economy, democracy in the world.
Well, that's a very interesting conclusion, and I've flipped through the book, and the question that really comes up is, if you say it's the economy, then what about caste, religion, jobs, unemployment, caste surveys, inheritance tax? Everything's been thrown in. Ram Mandir, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's point about Muslims getting a share of resources. What about all of those very diverse points that come up in an election?
Yeah, so that's a very good summary of all the other factors that make. So when I say, and when I think other analysts say it's the economy, it's a very Adam Smithian. It is, how has your individual welfare changed in the last 5 years? So it's very Adam Smithian. How have you personally benefited or lost by whatever the incumbent government did in the preceding election period? So it includes your benefits that you have obtained in the last 5 years, in particular, the food subsidies that two-thirds of the Indian population is able to obtain, the houses that have been built, the chulas, the improvement in sanitation, toilets, all of them come into your well-being, including your income growth and including your consumption growth. So it's all of the above. Now, it made, and the other factors that you've mentioned, I think they play a role, but it's not a dominant role. It has only a partial explanation for, and at some times they play a large role. At some times they play a small role. But the consistent theme, the consistent dominant explanator is how your personal welfare has improved. So what the voter does, when she goes into the voting booth, she thinks about how her life has changed. And she also thinks about, well, how will my life change if the opposition were to come in? And if the opposition were to come in, will the change be higher or lower, positively, obviously, otherwise I won't wait, than if I voted for the incumbent? That's the calculus, and I challenge anybody to tell me that's not how. I mean, the evidence is so strong that that's how they base it on. That's not to say other factors do not matter, but it is to say that if you're looking, you're an economist, you're a statistician, you look at numbers, what's 70% of the explanation due to? It's not 100, but it is 70%, is by the simple but involved metric of how your life has changed.
Your book also makes this point that one of the big stories about this election is that India is in transition from a lower middle income to a middle income economy today and a developed economy tomorrow. And then you go on to say that yes, we have seen this movie before in India Shining 2004. So when you talk about the transition, how significant a factor is that likely to be playing out this time around?
I think much more significant than it was in 2004, and perhaps we can discuss what happened in 2004. There is a new, what's the expression, new spirit in people's walk. They see themselves, look, I was obviously very much there in 2004, and I was very much there in the first Indian election. So, India has transformed in ways that I never thought possible. You started to believe in an India starting in 1991. That was the first, so you can forget the first 50 years of India's, approximately 50 years of India's, post-India's independence. Then we started to believe, and we've had consistent growth since 1991. But what there has been is there has been a marked acceleration post-2014 in the aggregate welfare of individuals. The growth rate has been high and almost the same, actually, as 2004 to 2011, a bit less, but at the same time, the world also grew less. So that's a factor. And then, this also, I think, has begun to be relevant in this election, from what one reads and talks to people and in interviews, that the Indians have a feeling that not that they have arrived, but they are arriving. So, Foreign Minister Jaishankar made this point yesterday as to how foreign policy is now entering into people's discussions. India's standing in the world, how it deals with its neighbors, how it deals with developed economies, advanced economies. The nature of our relationship is changing to a more equal status than what was before. And all of this, enters into the voter's mind.
Dr. Bala, how do you think the youth are approaching this election exercise? Because if you talk about 2004, there was a certain mood, and if we go back to the mid-90s, one of the differences as a voter myself that I can recall is the angry youth, the unrest on campuses, student bodies and their sort of oversized influence outside of campuses also, to now when you could say that this is the post-mobile phone generation. How is that approaching this election exercise in your view?
I don't think youth anywhere in the world change. That's the nature of youth. You are more ambitious, or you are. So I think youth everywhere around the world thinks differently. What's that old saying? If you are 20 and you have no heart, then and if you are 30 and you have no mind. So I think, that's a individual development stage around the world. Now, directly to your question of how the youth are seeing. One way to approach how the youth are seeing, apart from in the context of what I've said in terms of foreign policy, how India is being viewed, emotional connect with the economy, with the leadership, with the vote, is how well have they done? Now, one often talked about metric is the unemployment rate. And for the youth, it's definitely higher than for the rest of the population. Well, let's look at, so I've looked at, according to our data, PLFS data, in 2022 and in 2011 and previous years, that the unemployment rate for those above 29 years of age is about 1% and has always been in that range. So let's take the youth out from there and let's look at 18 to 29 years of age. And there, the unemployment rate today is somewhere around 10%. And in 2019, at the time of the previous election, it was somewhere around 15%. So there's been a definite improvement in the unemployment rate of the youth. So, they're looking at that. Now, I should point out that before you ask me that question, what often comes up, the unemployment rate in India is very high because you advertise for 100 jobs and 20 million people apply for the job. Now, obviously, the numbers are not accurate, but it is the case that every time the government advertises for a job, there are lots more applicants than there are people. Now, the reason that is happening is that, we're all aspirational, we all want the good job, and we all want the best job. And we want the job for which we have to work the least and get the most. And that's what government jobs are. Okay? So everybody wants a government job. So don't give me the statistic on so many people applied for a government job, which is the primary statistic that the opposition economists use all the time. I think it's completely meaningless. Look at what's happened to employment. look at what happened to unemployment, and look at what has happened to wages, and then we can go forward. But to tell me that people are applying for a government job is the people are applying for the best life that they think is possible for them. Not everybody gets the best life that is they think is possible for them.
That's a fair point, that many of these people have a different view as far as government jobs are concerned. So if caste and religion and the economy and jobs and unemployment and wages are some of the key factors, what about religion specifically today, Dr. Bhalla, especially for the youth or women voters? Does it really matter? Because a lot of people have said that the Lord Ram temple in Ayodhya is a very big sort of pivotal moment as far as that aspect is concerned.
So let me get directly, and this is something that I discuss in detail in the book. So one aspect of religion that I can look at objectively, there are very subjective ways in which you can approach religion. But one very objective way to look at religion and is in economic terms is to what has happened to your real wages if you are Muslim and or if you are Hindu. Okay? So in other words, the assumption is that if you are a Muslim, there is discrimination against you, maybe has increased prior to earlier, and so on and so forth. So your wages are going to rise less than for the Hindu. It turns out just the opposite. Matter of fact, the 2022, the margin, the difference between a Muslim and a Hindu is about 15% higher for a Muslim. So you do not get from the economic data, which is wages, that the Muslims are getting a lower wage after controlling for their education and so on and so forth. So same thing you control. So there is no evidence. Then you have Pew surveys, etc., that Hindus and Muslims like to live equally and separately, equally on both sides. That they don't. I personally think that there should be a lot more, but if you will, co-integration, as you would say, between the living together. But this is a Pew survey, national survey, and on attitudes. And what you find is both communities want to be equal and separate. Obviously, you cannot be completely equal and you cannot be completely separate, but that's the tendency. So I think religion, now one other aspect about religion, I saw a recent article where on women, and these were Muslim women in UP, and they were interviewed, and they said, their lives have really distinctly improved since Yogi came in, or since 2017. Law and order, safety, they can go out into the streets, not be harassed, and so on and so forth. And then they said, look, so the person asked, okay, are you going to vote for the BJP? They said, no, because the religious leaders don't want us to. So this is what I'm saying, that people look at how their personal lives have improved. Now, we don't know what they would do when they go into the polling booth, but clearly they are stating that we have to go by what the religious authorities tell us to do. I think we are following, Indians, Muslims, Hindus, Sikh, Isai, are following less and less the dictates of the religious leaders and more about their own welfare. That's, we were talking about an advanced economy. That's what happens. That look at any advanced economy, how much is religion being discussed? Though these very same advanced economies, 100 years ago, religion was a very important factor in people's lives. So that's what happens. When you develop, and as you develop, religion, caste, sex becomes less and less of a factor in your life than when you're not so developed. That's what is called development.
Dr. Bhalla, explain the different voting behavior that we see in assembly elections and the national Lok Sabha election. Most parties offer some sort of welfare support and promises. You could call it Redistribution. The BJP has a massive food program, which you also alluded to. Other parties offer free electricity, free bus rides, and the laundry list is very long. But why does the voter vote differently from a state election to a federal election? What is the peculiar feature and reason for that kind of voting behavior?
So I think there is a very important question embedded in your question. Not so much voting differently in states and national elections. So that is also a factor. So let me address the states versus national. In the national election, you're looking for leadership. In the state election, you're looking for what has happened in your life from the state leadership. On both counts, Mr. Modi comes out way ahead. But let me take the larger one that, look, I have pointed out, and I point out in the book, that basically, whether you look at Narega, whether you look at, in particular, the food subsidies, that these were policies that were enacted long time ago. The food subsidies are there since late 1960s. So let me take a minute to talk about food subsidies. And on your program and other programs and written articles, I have really said that the PDS system was one of the most corrupt systems in the world. And indeed, Rajiv Gandhi, back in 1985, said that only 15% of the money meant for the poor through PDS actually reached the poor. Now, the conclusion was that, look, Rajiv Gandhi was really a wild-eyed optimist, because the money that reached the poor from the PDS was less than 15%. Even he had exaggerated it. Now, I've written my papers and research, and one of the real winners for Mr. Modi in terms of the welfare programs is that the food subsidy now reaches something like 800 million people. And the targeting, which is what we are really after, is about 90%. So from 15% of the people getting the money they should be getting, it is now close to 90% of the money that they should be getting, they are getting. And the poor see that. Now, I happen to think that we have to rethink our policies. This was, I don't think that 2/3 of the economy needs free food, and I think they should decrease the eligibility for free food and give more, give some cash transfers as well as free food to the poor, let's say the bottom third of the population, and they get twice as much money as they're getting today. But so anyway, this is something that the new government should think about, in my view. But I think that's the big difference when you say it's performance that is now helping Modi and the BJP. It's performance in delivery of benefits, not the fact that the same benefits are there today as before. They are not the same. People are getting much more today than they ever got before from the state.
Can redistribution help us remove poverty? Because there is some amount of redistribution that's happening, and if you go by some claims that have been made in the run-up to this election, there is a massive amount of redistribution that is being promised. Does that really help an economy?
Well, let me answer with first look at the evidence, what has been shockingly positive evidence from the recent Consumer Expenditure Survey of 22-23 compared to 2011-12, that inequality, consumption inequality, has actually declined.
Okay.
Never before in either India's history or the world history do you see inequality declining. It may not rise by much or it rises by a lot, but declining is something very, very rare event. So that's the first point. The second point, does it help? And that's why I'm saying we need to make our policies much more efficient than they are today. So I think redistribution, and indeed one of the chapters in my book is called Redistribution with Growth. And that's much before the present debate started in exactly those terms. So I'm very pleased that those terms are being used. But it is the case that you have a phenomenal occurrence of redistribution through the tax system as well as through transfers, such that you have less inequality today than you had before. So that doesn't mean we've reached perfection. And there's a long chapter, the last chapter, where I discuss the challenges for the economy and what we have taken for granted. We should begin to relook, like farm subsidies and farm laws, etc., which unfortunately
We'll come to that. And before I do that, Dr. Balla, one of the points is about the Congress manifesto and some of the claims and statements which have been made outside of the Congress manifesto. What kind of impact do you think, if this Congress manifesto, if the party got the chance to implement it, would it have as far as the economy is concerned, our fiscal situation, and more importantly, our tax? And we now have the inheritance tax bogey that has come up again in this election.
Okay, one study of mine that hasn't got as much, but I wrote it about 3 years ago, and I'm going to update it. I very strongly feel, and the evidence, through the evidence, that we are taxed too much, not too little. And if you compare the average tax rate in India, taking into account all taxes, state and local and central, that we are paying something like 19% of total income in taxation. What's the story in most of our competitors, and including East Asia, as well as much beyond East Asia? It's about 16, 17%. So we should reduce the tax rate because of the following. You will get more efficiency and you will get more revenue, because tax compliance will go up with a reduction in the tax rate. So that's why I think the most urgent attention for the government, whichever the government comes in on June 4th, is to reform direct taxes. We have reformed corporate taxes, so nothing more needs to be done. That was done in 2018, but 2019. But we do need to reform direct taxes. And I believe the GST, which has been hugely successful, it's a national tax, it's a big winner, but I do think that the average tax being paid through GST is higher than what it should be. So, just the opposite, that we need lower taxes, not higher taxes, as the Congress is arguing. And I wish they would give evidence as to, not because the US has, and 6 states in the US have an inheritance tax. Even the rate that Petroda got was 50% when it's actually 20%. So I think my plea is for everybody to first get the facts right. And that's what a lot of the book is about. Let the data speak, and let's get our facts right. And then we can advance policies based on logic and based on facts.
Dr. Balla, one of the things that perhaps our viewers may not fully appreciate is the latest proposals, taxation proposals in the budget that was unveiled in March by US President Joe Biden, and that's supposed to come into effect from the next financial year if he were to come to power. But that talks about a very significant increase in capital gains. It talks about doing away with many types of exemptions, and the overall tax incidence is likely to therefore go up for taxpayers in the United States. Isn't there therefore a larger question that is connected to inequality in India, and perhaps the fact that when it is business owners, large companies, they got a cut in 2018, but there hasn't been one, like you yourself mentioned, as far as personal income tax is concerned, in a major way?
No, look, a personal income tax hasn't been a reform, and I think the personal income tax rates are too high, especially, nothing wrong. Well, there is some, I would not have 3 slabs, I would have 2 slabs between 10 and 30. But what really is a kicker is the surcharges, which are put in there because the central government gets that revenue and the states don't get it. So we really need to rethink. I think it's unfair for the states not to get that money. But at the same time, we needed to have there's an interesting story here on the GST and the guarantee by the government that they would get, each state would get a 15% increase in the revenue that they already had for 5 years, okay? And the way they got the 15%, they looked at how much did tax revenue go up in the previous 5 years, and the average increase was 15%. Well, that was when inflation was 10%. And so therefore, an average of 10, 11%, and the state revenue was determined as to it should be on that. So I think, what my argument throughout has been, and in the book, is let the data speak. By that I mean, there's good data and there's bad data, and it's the responsibility of civil society, of journalists, of people like you, and researchers like me, etc., to provide a check and balance on the misuse of data. Once you do that, you will get much more effective policies, and you won't get this thing, oh my God, wealth inequality in India has gone up, which is based on fictitious data by a French economist, Piketty, whose own results have now, for the US, brought into serious criticism and challenge. So, for example, just you might be interested in knowing what Piketty et al. Had claimed, that in the US, that the top 1% had increased their share by about 10 percentage points over between 2008 and now, when the exact number is, after you do the calculation, is about 2 or 3 percentage points gain. So again, it comes back to my plea, let the data speak. So therefore, you can make, and the estimates for India, which Oxfam is very pleased to use, and others, the estimates for India are completely manufactured. They don't have any relationship. We don't have an income distribution survey. We don't have a wealth survey. And in taxation, we have a lot of compliance problems. And if anything, the compliance amongst the rich is a lot more than the compliance amongst the middle class. So I don't want to get into details, but really, let's all be objective. Let's look at what the data is saying and then base our policies on that, rather than we think it should be this way or we think it should be that way.
Absolutely, and you've spoken about the need to depoliticize data collection, not ban the release of data that's collected, and you also said that data reform is the easiest of reforms, and while all countries face statistical issues, India faces survey collection issues. What are the other challenges, Dr. Bhalla, that that Prime Minister Modi confronts, and in the third term, as everyone expects him to get, what are some of the key economic challenges that he will face and should address?
Well, first, I want to reiterate what you just said. For an informed policy making, which is, after all, Siddharth, what you and I are talking about. For an informed policy making, let us first agree on or disagree on what the data is. One simple reform that the government can bring in, the easiest reform, there is, every time the government collects data on such and such date, the data should be released. Simple. So we don't get this, the government feels it's not good to release the data, they don't release it. It's good that you put in, India needs to debureaucratize and depoliticize data collection, exactly this. So that's the easiest thing to implement. I really do hope that they do, especially since the challenge is, and the goal is, and the objective is for India to be a developed society by 2047. And I think we'll reach the target. But really, we can start now. And the first thing that every developed society has, it depoliticizes and debureaucratize, I would emphasize, debureaucratize data collection. Then the other challenges. This whole North-South debate, I think, is quite unnecessary. And it really, we are one country. And obviously, some states will go faster than others. The third issue that they have to address is in terms of, as I mentioned, taxation and the decrease in tax rates for individuals in particular. So direct tax reform should be high on the agenda. And last but not least, farm laws and what to do about the PDS system and what to do with extensive government involvement in agriculture. So, these are some major challenges, and how to think about subsidies. I think we need to get into direct benefit transfers much more than we are doing. I think the government needs to be congratulated for really moving quite significantly ahead on direct benefit transfers, and I think we need to do a lot more.
Absolutely, Dr. Bhalla, because the needs of the Indian economy are multiple, and there is obviously always more than enough work that needs to be done. Dr. Bhalla, thank you very much for your time with us. You've given us a very broad strokes understanding of how India votes, and we will get to know the results on the 4th of June of how indeed India has voted this time around, and we hope to connect with you when that happens. Once again, thank you very much, and all the very best for your latest book. Viewers, with that, it's a wrap on this episode of Easynomics. We'll be back with more. Until then, goodbye.
Indigo, the company has placed fresh orders of 50 new aircraft